Today is still October 17, 2019. It is 7:20. We have a quorum. We are still in discussing the Ellis substitute on item 29. Councilmember Kassar.
Mayor, Councilmember Alter just handed out.
I can make
this. No, you can. I just wanted to make it quicker by saying that I'm supportive because I think that this is what we all assumed the whole time.
Okay, I'm going to let Councilmember Alter lay out her amendment.
I did not move it. I just wanted to say that.
Then I'm going to ask if there are any objections to it being included. Councilmember Alter.
So I move to amend 9411C of the substitute document as follows. C, unless a law enforcement officer determines that there's an imminent health or safety threat, a law enforcement officer must, before citing a person for a violation of this section, make a reasonable effort to. So it adds, unless a law enforcement officer determines that there's an imminent health or safety threat. And I conferred with Ann Morgan during the break, and her recommendation was to include it, and she identified the right location for that. If anyone wants to hear from her, she's prepared to speak.
Is there any objection to that amendment being included?
Mayor, we'd like to vote on it, please.
And I'll second it.
Okay. Catherine Poole seconds it. Any discussion? Those in favor of the amendment, please raise your hand. Those opposed? Unanimous on the dais with Councilmember Tovo off.
I know you were.
Good. Any other amendments to this that someone wants to bring?
Mayor, I have one.
Councilmember Kitchen.
Here you go. Here you go. I'm sorry. Okay. Are you ready? Should I?
Yeah, why don't you lay it out?
Okay. So this amends subsection B to put it in wherever the appropriate place is, and it's to clarify that there are restrictions on camping, sitting, or lying down on a traffic island, median strip, median island, intersection island, or other similar area under a highway overpass that separates opposing traffic flows with either a painted area or a raised curb where one of the traffic flows is a Texas U-turn lane. So I wanted to read it all out because this is one of the areas that we this is one of the items that I made changes to after hearing people's concerns. I had heard that there was some concerns before. We had just talked in terms of traffic islands and median strips, and I had heard some concerns about where those might be and that it might be too broad. So I added language that would define it more specifically, that relates more closely to the concerns about safety, and that is I added the language under a highway overpass, and then I added the language where one of the traffic flows is a Texas U-turn lane. So the example that I'm aware of is the area under the Ben White overpass at Manchac, which I think folks are familiar with, and some of the people that testified spoke to that area earlier. And I also have something else to pass.
So let me go ahead and get a second to that real fast. Councilmember Kitchen moves the amendment she's handed out about camping, sitting, lying on a traffic island. And thereafter, is there a second to that amendment? Councilmember Alter seconds that.
Okay. The only other thing I was going to say here is that we've received information from the neighborhood association that's right there that is asking us to make this clarification. So I wanted to pass that out for everyone. Okay. If there are still concerns about this being too broad, I'm happy to work with the language. But I think it's important to clarify both for the public and the folks that live in that area, as well as other areas in the city, that these places are not safe to be.
Okay, thank you. Discussion of this amendment. Chief, can you come down? Thanks, Chief. And again, thank you for spending yet another entire day with us.
Absolutely, Mayor.
There's an amendment in front of us now that would add specifically that it's an offense to camp, sit, or lie on a traffic island, a median strip, a median island, an intersection island, or other similar area under a highway overpass that separates opposing traffic flows with either a painted area or raised curb, where one of the traffic flows is a Texas U-turn lane. And Councilmember Kitchen, who made this, said that in her mind she was thinking about the overpass at Manchac and Ben White. In your bulletin, the training bulletin, on the existing law that says that people shouldn't be at a place where they're endangering themselves or others, you put in specifically that people shouldn't be where they are so close to a roadway where there's a substantial risk that a car could leave the roadway and strike a person camping or the like.
Yes.
And here's my question, because I'm real appreciative that you did this bulletin, and I'm thinking of the area that Councilmember Kitchen's thinking of with the overpass at Manchac, but probably a couple others in town. Maybe where Congress Avenue crosses over Ben White and people have a grill right next to the traffic and the like. I mean, some of those, to my eye, seem to be pretty unsafe for the reasons that you have. And I know that there's a resolution that may or may not be passed by council that urges staff to take a look at those. But you have it in your authority right now, consistent with the bulletin, to look at something like that and say, this just really isn't a safe area for people to be. Is that correct?
Yes, we included that language to address situations like you're describing, as well as just other places where people are conducting that type of behavior too close to the vehicular traffic on the roadways.
So would we be expecting over time here shortly for you and the force and the manager to start identifying those areas and keeping everybody safe?
Yes, what we're working on is the approach where the first step, unless it's an extremely hazardous situation that needs to be immediately addressed, we're working on those opportunities to first work with the homeless individuals to look for housing opportunities or other places, but then after that to go ahead and take the appropriate action. Keeping in mind, we have to pay attention to that danger factor. If we're doing this because their conduct is dangerous, then we really don't have the time to wait in those circumstances. But it is meant to address, again, those folks that are too close to the traveled roadway, separated by curb only, as well as some of these highway overpasses. Even if there's a guardrail there, we have seen crashes where the dynamics of the crash will put a vehicle over that guardrail and therefore could pose danger or hazard to those individuals under that overpass.
So when you're doing that and you're applying that section, you might apply it to not only the area that's described here by Councilmember Kitchen, but you might be applying it to other similarly unsafe spots in the city.
The language that's included in the training bulletin is not limited to just under overpasses, and the language, as I understand it, in the amendment that's being looked at now also talks about the slanted portion of the embankment and others, and depending upon how far setback that is, that might not address a hazard.
And this one this isn't the slope one. I think that may be coming at a second one.
Sorry.
That's okay. This one was just traffic island median strip under an overpass, separating traffic flows with a raised curb where next to a Texas U-turn. So in this case, I think, Councilmember Kitchen, you've done a really good job of trying to narrow it down to one specific area. And my concern with this is I think it needs to be broader, as is the law, just to endanger. And I'm concerned about putting something in the ordinance that limits your ability to look at any median or any, I know it doesn't limit it, but I'm much more comfortable keeping the general language you already have in our ordinance, which says correct situations where people are endangering themselves or others, and then address it as you have done here. And I guess it's you have the ability to go after exactly the spot that Councilmember Kitchen is raising if you think that's unsafe. It looks to be unsafe, but it also enables you to go after others as well. And I just wanted to make sure that you had that authority and power.
The way it's written now, it's meant to address both conduct under bridges and in other areas that we deem to be hazardous.
Okay, thank you, Chief. Councilmember Casar, then we'll come back.
Yeah, and for similar reasons, Chief, first of all, I appreciate the approach taking of going whence there is not an imminent danger to trying to connect folks to services first. I appreciate that you all are working on that approach. And I just can't support this for the same reason that some of the things described here the police department may not find to be dangerous, in which case I don't think they should be included. But whenever the police department does find it to be dangerous and meeting the standard here, I would leave it up to them to decide what is dangerous in this situation.
Okay, Councilmember Poole.
So I'm just curious, and maybe our esteemed lawyers can answer this one. I don't know if it's Mr. Crawford or somebody else. There we go, Mr. Coppola. So let's say we have a situation where an officer under the aegis of the training bulletin takes some action along these lines. And we end up in a lawsuit in a courtroom, and we are having to defend the action that the officers took. And we would be pointing to language in a training bulletin that is not specifically stated in any ordinance language, but rather is inferred from some ordinance language based on what we're talking about here. Because what we keep saying is, well, we don't have to say it in the ordinance because it is inferred and covered by interpretation and adoption in a training bulletin, which is a lower level document than an ordinance. So, Mr. Coppola, if we were in a lawsuit in a courtroom, would that carry as much weight, saying it's in a training bulletin as opposed to direction in an ordinance?
I think were a case to be prosecuted if somebody was camping in an area that was dangerous because it was too close to a roadway. I think the prosecutors would be pointing back to the language in the ordinance, which is there now, that you're not allowed to camp if it's a spot that's endangering yourself or others. So I think they would be pointing back to the ordinance. The training bulletin is merely, as you suggested, Councilmember, interpretation of what's in the existing law. It doesn't carry any sort of legal authority in and of itself.
Right. Which is why I think we are all wanting to be crystal clear in the ordinance, because we don't want to leave anything to interpretation and the possibility in a courtroom situation that we may be allowing ourselves to be vulnerable. So I support the specificity that is offered in this amendment and, of course, in some previous amendments for those same reasons. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember Poole. That's one of the reasons for the need for clarity in the ordinance itself. The other thing about it is just a couple of questions for you, Chief. So first off, would you read to me that language in the training bulletin? I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me, that you're relying on.
And Chief, I have a copy of it here if you don't. Okay.
Sorry, I thought he had it.
That's okay.
I don't have it, that's why. Okay, so, Chief, that's all right, I found it. So are you relying on the language that says is close enough to a roadway where there is substantial risk that a car could leave the roadway and strike a person camping?
Correct. That's the bullet that we're looking at.
What constitutes substantial risk?
That's, as we are in many of these circumstances, the officer's judgment. That is our experience with working crashes, our experience with understanding the dynamics of vehicles and what can and can't happen in crash situations, and whether the circumstances we find someone in pose that hazard. So it's another one of those circumstances that we have where it'll be up to the officer's interpretation and judgment.
Okay, so the interpretation of substantial risk is up to each individual officer, and that's what we ask them to do, so there's nothing wrong with that. But that's how you have to interpret that, right? So
Correct.
basically what we're relying on is we're 2 steps removed in terms of interpretation. We're using a standard that's in the ordinance that's not specific, and so we're interpreting that standard in the ways that you have listed here. And then what you've listed here has to be interpreted again by each individual officer, and that's the way you have to work, obviously. So wouldn't it be much clearer if we actually stated in the ordinance that the specifics of the area that we're talking about? Because then it would not be subject to each individual officer's interpretation, nor would it be something that you had to, in a court of law, that you couldn't rely on. So wouldn't it be clearer to have the actual language in the ordinance?
I do think if we are in court testifying on an action that we took under this provision, whether it be ordinance or training bulletin, I think if it's spelled out in an ordinance, it would be much more clear for the court, and that would address the circumstances that this amendment looks at. We would still leave the training bulletin in place to address
Sure.
other circumstances where that might be applicable, but that are not covered by this amendment that's being considered right now.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor.
Further discussion, Councilmember Flanagan.
So
And I've been told for the people that are watching us on TV, the closer we can get to the mics, the better off we are. Mr. Flanagan.
I'll try. Lean in. The definition of this amendment, it took a little effort to figure out what that meant, and I started looking through spot checking Google Maps areas that I think would qualify here. There's a lot of diversity of width that would comply with this area, and I don't know that the intention is to do as much as I think this will do. And I'm also a little concerned about the really hyper focus on prosecution when we're really trying not to criminalize folks. We are trying to get them help, and I think police discretion is exactly the sweet spot for getting that done, identifying where things are safe, where they're not safe, letting our officers make the very complex decisions as they have to do on a regular basis.
Further discussion, Councilmember Kassar.
What I understand from the current ordinance is that dangerous medians, if somebody's on a median in a dangerous way, then our current ordinance covers it. The reason I oppose the amendment is if a police officer believes that it's not dangerous, this could make it so that not dangerous camping on, say a median, as Councilmember Flanagan mentioned, is wide enough that somebody's far away and not bothering anyone. The not dangerous part would then be covered, which is why I can't vote for this.
Councilmember Tovo.
Yeah, I am going to vote for it for the reasons that one of my colleagues, I think it was Councilmember Poole, articulated earlier. You know, there's a value of providing all of the information or most of the information in specific examples within the ordinance itself. I think it is of value to individuals experiencing homelessness who want to know which areas camping is and is not allowed. I think it's of value to the public, and I think it's of value to our law officers to have those within it. There was a concern raised earlier that perhaps it was more limited than the training bulletin. I thought that Councilmember Kitchen, you had addressed that by adding in language in our version that said including. I don't know whether that's carried over to the mayor's version or not, but that would be one way of mitigating that concern, putting the word including in, so it's clear that these are examples of places that would be hazardous, but there might be some that weren't envisioned. I think having the way the conversation has transpired concerns me a bit, where we seem to be providing direction to the police chief to put other examples in a training bulletin. We don't direct the police chief. That's beyond our role. What we do have charter ability to do is amend an ordinance. And so the way this conversation is transpiring concerns me a bit. And again, I think for clarity for all of those who might wish to be really clear on where camping is and is not allowed, I think it's best in the ordinance.
Further discussion, Councilmember Alter.
I second this, and I support the motion. I'm concerned about this interpretation. Well, it's all on the police to interpret it in the training bulletin. That seems to give a lot of discretion to the police, and that seems to run counter to the points that were raised through the discussion all the way along, and so that makes me uncomfortable, and I'm going to support being very specific where we need to be.
Mayor?
Councilmember Kitchen.
I'd like to call up our transportation department.
Okay.
The other thing that concerns me is we are expecting our police to be experts in traffic issues. And there are reasons why medians are not intended for people to camp on because there are safety issues. So and Councilmember Flanagan, if you have concerns about the width, I'm happy to add an amendment to specify a width, because I'm not, I'm not talking about hugely wide medians. I'm talking about these medians that are dangerous. So, Mr. Dale, could you speak to the fact that I know in conversations that I've had with the Transportation Department and with the information that you all provided us a while back, actually, where you listed definitions of places. I know that medians were one of the areas that were listed as not intended for people to spend a lot of time on, that they were intended for areas for people to pass through. And so I just would like you to speak to that.
Jim Dale, Assistant Director for the Transportation Department. Yes, most medians are used for just temporary refuge for pedestrians as they pass through that area. In terms of the areas that you're talking about and the language here, of course, the concern, I think, as everyone knows here, is with the U-turn traffic mounting the curb, and like the chief had mentioned too, even crossing over the guardrails at times could definitely put someone at risk who's there for prolonged periods of time.
And would that be a greater risk for a bigger vehicle like a bus? If there's buses going through a turn lane, would that be a greater concern in terms of a vehicle going through a guardrail and being of danger to people there?
There's two main aspects that we look at in terms of risk here, and that is the volume of traffic, whether it's just even automobiles as well as the larger trucks, but also the speed of the traffic.
Okay.
TxDOT has mentioned about, criteria for distances back from a curb for clear zone areas.
Okay.
But that varies. There's a spectrum of that.
Okay.
And now you run into, like the chief has mentioned, and he can better speak to it in terms of having to measure distances for enforcement, but also being able to convey that information to the people who are there where they can be and where they can't be.
Okay, thank you very much. I have one last question for the police chief, if that's...
That's fine.
Okay. So, Chief Manley, have you determined that the intersection at Ben White and Manchac is an area that falls into the definition of close enough to a roadway there is a substantial risk that a car could leave the roadway and strike a person camping?
I know we've talked about this a time or two. I don't have exact measurements for how far that danger would exist, but given the traffic that travels through that intersection, both the volume of traffic and the speed of traffic, I believe that would fall in the description that we've given as being hazardous. But as far as how close to that guardrail we would make that determination, I, as the police chief, am not going to give direction saying if someone is within that 7 feet or that 8 feet, whatever that would look like, or 10 feet or whatever. It's really going to be up to that officer that's on the scene, because again, they'll be the one that's in court that has to testify as to what they observed that day that made them believe that that person's being in that space posed that hazard.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll just close. Shall I close them? I think this is an instance where it's a responsibility of the city council as a policy matter to make a statement about safety. I have offered to narrow this, but I'm not hearing from my colleagues any other language. I'm happy to make the language more specific if there's a concern. And I'm also not hearing why people are concerned, so if they are concerned. So I hope that you all will consider voting for this. We have no assurance that these areas would be considered dangerous, and I think it's our responsibility for public health and safety to vote on this. So I would appreciate your vote.
Thank you. Manager, in this discussion about the ordinance and what we've done and what we might need to do or could do, I think the point's well taken that none of us here should be or could be instructing the police chief on what he should be doing or not doing. But we can talk to you about managing the city generally. And I think from a policy standpoint, this council has said that we don't want, in these kinds of instances, people materially endangering the health and safety of other people or themselves. It would be one thing if we were hearing from you and hearing from the department, the transportation department, and hearing from the police department that none of the islands that we have are unsafe. If that's what we were hearing and the council felt differently, then I think the council might very well need to act. But what we are hearing from both transportation and from the police is that we have islands where there are people that are not safe and people are materially endangering themselves. In that instance, I think that the city needs to act. And I think that you as the manager, I think need to, in managing the city, need to make sure that that's not happening. You know, for one, I understand where you are. I think that the council has made the policy decision in saying we don't want people materially endangering. Your staff seems to indicate that there are places around where that would qualify. If that's the case, then you need to implement the law, I think. And I think that's a better way to do that, because it's not limited just to the circumstances that's being proposed here, but to other islands or medians that might also be similarly unsafe or might be unsafe that don't meet this criteria.
Appreciate that, Mayor. And I think that part of the conversation that we're having right now is also the manner in which that is implemented. And so, as the chief mentioned, if it's not an immediate danger, then there will be discussions that we would have with those individuals so we can connect them to services. That's part of the discussion here, and that may take time. So I think the immediacy and the gauge in which our staff are looking at each of those situations does vary with each situation that they encounter.
And that makes sense to me, so long as we're moving forward, because I also support that deliberative process and balancing those two things. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate that it's moving forward. Any further discussion on the amendment? Councilmember Kitchen.
Okay, so I'm not sure what I'm hearing here. So am I hearing that, City Manager, that there's agreement that the kinds of areas I've described are dangerous?
I think what you heard from the chief is that we look at these situations on a case-by-case basis. And so as we look at those situations, we will determine, our staff will determine, how quickly there is a need to potentially move people to a safer environment. But if the danger isn't imminent, then that conversation may take place over time, because we need to make sure that they have appropriate available resources to connect them to services, unless we are directed differently through these ordinances to take action in a more immediate circumstance.
Yeah, I wasn't asking about I certainly understand that it takes time to take action. I'm asking more about the determination that an area is unsafe. So I'm not sure what I'm hearing. Am I hearing that we have made a decision as a council or as staff that the areas that I've described here are unsafe, or is there still a judgment call to be made?
I mean, I'll defer to the chief and to the transportation department. I don't know every single traffic island so this is broader than that. And so without knowing exactly every single situation and how large those areas are, it would be hard to make a determination on the spot.
Okay, so there's still a judgment call to be made, and it sounds like there's still a judgment call to be made about the example I provided. So we don't have any clarity unless we put this in the ordinance, and then there's clarity. So that concerns me, and I don't want us to pretend that we are promising to the public and the folks that live in that area that we're making a decision today that area is unsafe, because that's not what we're doing.
Okay, and further discussion, Councilmember Poole?
I'm also concerned, frankly, about allowing people to be on medians and in culverts and in high wildfire risk areas, for example, but right here in these medians. So we would allow them to set up camp there unless and until there is evidence of imminent risk to their well-being. So what happens if at 2 a.m. on a Friday night, an 18-wheeler comes through the Texas U-turn and mows down that campsite and kills the people that are on the median? And are we liable? What is the city's liability? I mean, how do we do? How do we prove that we have done something to protect that particular person who has now been the victim of an awful, awful accident, wreck, whatever? They weren't expected to be there, and it was late at night, and maybe it was raining, and I mean all kinds of things. But somebody died, and that's on us. Is that okay? I don't think that's okay at all.
Okay, further discussion on this amendment? Let's take a vote. Those in favor of the kitchen amendment, please raise your hand. Tovo, kitchen, pool, alter. Those opposed, please raise your hand. It's the balance of the dice. Next item. Are there any more amendments to the substitute? Councilmember Kitchen?
No?
Oh, Councilmember Tovo, I'm sorry.
Well, this...
I'm going to ask my colleague to lay it out.
Okay.
So this is Councilmember Tovo's motion, and I'm going to help with this. I move to amend subsection 9411B to include camping, sitting, or lying in the bed or on the bank of a creek or river and within 5 feet of the top of the bank of a creek or river. This is for both safety concerns in flood risk areas and also for the environmental concern for fragile edges of our creeks and riverbanks. And I don't know if there is who to call on from what. Ramesh?
So Councilmember Poole reads in Councilmember Tovo's amendment. Is there a second to that amendment? Councilmember Tovo seconds the amendment. Go ahead, Councilmember Poole.
Yes, sir. Ramesh, could you speak to the safety concerns both for a person on the bank of a creek or a riverbed, including 5 feet from the top of the bank, and also the vulnerable nature of our riparian edges?
Mayor and Council, Ramesh Swaminathan with Watershed Protection. So there is an inherent risk for folks to be close to the creek in a conveyance channel. However, it's kind of hard to determine if it's a 5 feet, because there could be where the creeks are narrow enough. And there are times when the creek is narrow and the banks is pretty steep, and 5 feet is too much, and there are times when the 5 feet is too little. So it's hard to determine if there's a specific way to say 5 feet is the right number. There is always what we do is whenever a situation like that comes, we will go and investigate a situation, and depending on the case, we would determine if there is a blockage in conveyance, there's a flood risk, there's all of those risks identified, and then we would make a determination based on that. So it's hard to say if 5 feet is the right number.
But if you don't look at the 5 feet, and perhaps I emphasized that too much, the larger point being creek beds and the edges of riverbeds and the banks. So camping in those the general vicinity of a creek and a river.
So there are vicinities of the creek which are farther enough from the creek which may not immediately pose a flood risk. There are times when the creek would rise even during a 100-year flood event where the water may not rise to
based
the top
on
of
the floodplain.
Floodplain. So there are multiple things that go into making that determination. So it's kind of hard to say that the top of the bank is safe or unsafe. So we would pretty much go and look at it from a case-by-case basis.
But this amendment would give you the authority to go and do that and provide us with some specific information on where that may or may not be safe for a person to set up a camp.
Well, we currently do that right now, not just for encampments, for any kind of obstruction that's on the creek or on top of the bank or anywhere close to the creek channel. We would go, in fact, if a citizen were to call and complain about, say, an object atop the bank, if it's causing any problems, we would go and investigate that right now. And we do that that's something that we would do right now. So atop the bank or in the creek is considered dangerous, and we would either remove it, or if there's an encampment, we would remove that, have that removed. So
very good. And I see, Mr. Coppola, did you have anything that you wanted to add as far as the legalities and the additional authorities that this gives city staff in whatever department to keep a close eye out for the health and welfare of people who may be pitching tents and living along creeks and riverbeds?
I guess I just want to clarify the amendment if I can, because it is for camping, sitting, or lying.
Right.
And, I think a lot of the discussion, I guess my impression is that just sitting or lying in an empty creek or riverbed may not be
They
as
might
dangerous.
actually just be cooling off.
Right. So I think in terms of protecting health and safety, I think camping is really maybe, and narrowing it a little bit, that might be a good
I think
way
that's a
to-
really good amendment. We can just delete the words sitting or lying, because we don't necessarily want to get involved if somebody is cooling off, but the camping for sure, in particular, because that indicates a situation where somebody would be sleeping potentially and also have all their personal belongings with them, and to get washed away by flash flood would be a really, that would be quite a tragic situation.
Absolutely.
And we would not be able to help them, and they would really be vulnerable. So with the indulgence of the dais, if you would please take out sitting or lying in that first.
Do you want to put it to a vote?
Sure.
Okay. I mean, I wasn't asking for that, but it's consistent with what you said earlier. You wanted to make sure all the amendments were put to a vote.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. It's been moved. The amendment to the amendment
Mayor.
is that we strike sitting and lying. Yes.
I don't think that's, I mean, if I could, I think it was just inadvertent that sitting and lying was in there, and I'm not sure that Councilmember Poole understood the question you were asking about whether it was necessary to put to a vote the removal of sitting and lying.
Oh, the taking out of the sitting and lying. I am amending my own amendment.
And that was really the intent. I
Is
mean,
there any objection to taking out sitting and lying from the amendment? Hearing none, it's taken out. Okay, continue
Mayor,
on.
if I
We
may.
have yes.
I just want to say a couple things about this. So back when we had our special called meeting and there was one ordinance with several alternatives, there was agreement among parties outside of today's subquorum that we did want to restrict camping in the bed and the bank of a creek or river. Where there was disagreement and where you saw the alternative was along the banks of the river. So I'm just not clear on why there was support for making sure that we're prohibiting camping in a creek and a river a month ago, and today we seem to be hearing concerns about that. So I just need I need somebody to please weigh in and help me understand why that is.
Councilmember Cassar, then Councilmember Ellis.
I think in September there was a sort of failed attempt to try to build a more unanimous consensus on this, but then, as in now, I don't think we need to add things into this that are already clearly prohibited. And you can see in the chief's training bulletin, it says it is prohibited to camp in a creek bed. So it's already prohibited now. I think, and I just don't support at this point, at this hour, with this number of amendments, just trying to go in and add everything that's already prohibited in. And then, as they mentioned, it's just deciding that 5 feet from a creek bed is per se dangerous means that that there will be some cases where you're 5 feet and it's not dangerous at all, and we're now criminalizing that. And there will be some cases where 6 feet is actually what's dangerous in that situation. So that's why I'm against this amendment.
Councilmember Ellis.
I was going to ask Mr. Swaminathan to clarify. I was reading something when you were answering the question. So it's already prohibited for people to be occupying those areas inside the creek bed?
Right. So if there was a complaint that there's somebody in the creek bed, we would go and look at it to make sure there's not any block and conveyance, and whether it's a person or an object or anything, even there's a large piece of wood, we would make sure that that blockage is removed. So that's just part of what we do to reduce flood risk.
Okay, thank you for repeating that. If that's already the case, I'm fine to not support this additional measure in there, especially because knowing exactly where that top of the bank or creek river is something that even wetland biologists have to get out there to go look at and see really what is a high water line and what does that look like, because it's not just flat land, a U, and flat land. So I'm okay with just sticking with the interpretation that's already happening.
Any further discussion on the Poole amendment? Councilmember Tolo.
Yeah, Mayor, to be clear, I don't have somewhere I have the chief's bulletin, but as you captured it, and I think this is what I remember from my memory of reading it, it speaks to creek beds. It doesn't speak to river beds. It doesn't speak to the banks of a creek or a river. So again, that's where we had consensus last month, because all of those are areas that are extremely unsafe. I mean, we had a situation in Shoal Creek last spring where an individual, I don't know if he was in the creek or on the bank or where he began, but he was and drowned. And so I think this is a very high priority area to make sure that we're making it clear that this is not an area where we want to see camping. I understand the trepidations about the bank. I understand that there were differing opinions about that. To me, that is also about protecting the water quality of our urban creeks, which we know from past discussions are challenged. And so having people living along right up to the edge, I think is also something we want to discourage. But at a minimum, I would hope we could get consensus for clarifying what is currently not in the bulletin, which is that camping would be prohibited in the riverbanks and in the riverbeds, as well as the banks of both the creek and the river. And so if it's helpful, perhaps we take them up separately. And so, and I will make that amendment to your amendment, which is that we first take up prohibiting camping in the bed or on the bank of a creek or a river.
Okay, Councilmember Tovo is moving to, you're saying just divide the question first. Okay, so Councilmember Tovo first wants to see if there is a majority of people to say camping in the bed or the bank of a creek or river, and then we would take then a subsequent vote on the 5 feet of the top of the bank. Councilmember Flanagan.
Just to reiterate, because I know we're going through a lot of these, I don't want the chief or the public to misunderstand that these votes are not making determinations. What I want to see is what I heard from our staff, which is the experts in safety, the experts on watersheds are the ones determining where it's safe to be. This is, I'm not going to support any part of this because it is precisely the type of context-sensitive situation we need our experts making the determination for. I know how it's all going to get reported later, but I just wanted to make that clear.
Okay. You ready to take a vote on the divided question? Councilmember Kitchen?
Thank you. I appreciate that, Councilmember Flanagan, but I just need to say that the determination is made by the police chief, so not under this ordinance. So it's not made by our water quality experts. And I'm not sure, no offense against the police chief, but I'm not sure that they're experts in water quality.
And in this regard, just for the record, the bulletin says that the chief has determined and instructed and trains his officers with respect to endangering that they could look at action justifying enforcement under the endangering prong, including camping in a public area in a location or manner that, and then it says, is in a creek bed or other area prone to predictable flash flooding. And then he says that the bulletin says the department will provide additional guidance on specific locations of flood-prone areas. And I think in his testimony earlier, he said he would be working with other city staffs to make that determination. All right, so we have, let's take a motion. Those in favor of adding camping in the bed or in the bank of a creek or river, please raise your hand. Tovo, Kitchen, and Pool. And Alter. Those opposed, please raise your hands. Balance of the dais. Doesn't make it. Okay. Any other amendments? I'm sorry, what? Yes, go ahead.
So I know that there's some folks here who are frustrated about going through the amendments. We spent a lot of time in putting together our item 29 and had thought a lot about areas where we thought it was important that we clarify for the community what we thought was dangerous and to preserve safety. And I appreciate hearing my colleagues' interpretation being different about what is allowed under the training bulletins, et cetera. And I just want to point out that there is value in explicating that folks feel that these places are safe or unsafe for the community. Our preference is to have it in the ordinance because I think the community is asking for greater clarity, and having to go look at the training bulletin or having to leave it to too much discretion doesn't provide that clarity. But I think there's value in having this conversation that even if those amendments don't pass, we have some greater shared understanding of what we all mean by it, even if we disagree on the process and what is providing the most clarity. So I just wanted to make that observation. I think it's been helpful to hear those perspectives. I disagree on that, from a legal perspective and a process perspective, but there is still value in us having that conversation and clarifying that we are in broader agreement about those elements. So.
Thank you. Councilmember Poole, you have an amendment?
I do, and this one is to amend the ordinance 9411 subsection B to include camping, sitting, or lying down on an ADA accessibility ramp. And the reasons for this, I think, should be pretty obvious.
Is there a second to the Poole amendment? Councilmember Kitchen, seconds. Go ahead.
But if not, I think Jim Dale, our favorite Austin Transportation Department Deputy Director, is still here. And I think Mr. Coppola and Ms. Fireside also are here. So I'd like to ask let me start with Public Works, or let's see, Transportation. Let me start with that. I would like to ask our transportation staff or law, so both of you gentlemen, thank you, about the importance of keeping ADA accessibility ramps clear of obstruction.
Is it all right if I start, Chris?
Of course,
Right.
please.
Thank you, gentlemen.
First, I'm going to have to let Rob know that comment that was made here, and that may get his attention even while he's traveling.
So the longer you stay in this room, the higher the elevation of the appreciation.
Well, Jim Dale, Assistant Director for the Transportation Department. So, yes, the accessibility ramps are very important to our community. There's considerable city funds that are put forth to constructing those ramps. Public Works leads a program. We also install them as well as far as signal reconstruction and so forth. So very important to the folks who are experiencing mobility impairments. And really, it's doing a number of things to provide safety for them, to be on the sidewalk and not in a travel lane. Also being able to provide access to other transportation services like transit, as well as businesses, residents, parks, libraries, and so forth. And then, of course, mobility in general, just to get to those places. So very, very important part of our transportation infrastructure.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Mr. Coppola.
I guess just to add to that, I mean, the city is obligated under Title II of the ADA to construct and maintain an accessible public areas, and accessibility ramps are part of that. Accessibility ramps are part of that obligation on sidewalks. Where new sidewalks are constructed, those sorts of features need to be constructed with them.
Thank you.
Yes, Councilmember Flanagan.
Chris,
Oh, yes, sir.
does that maintenance requirement require that they be unobstructed?
It's a requirement that they're built to a certain standard in the ADA. I don't think it would be fair to say it's a requirement that it be prohibited that the city have a criminal prohibition on camping, sitting, or lying there. I don't think that's required by the ADA.
But we already have rules in place that allow us to move people if they're blocking an ADA ramp.
The current, the current ordinances, 9411, the camping ordinance, and then 9414. 9411 prohibits people from camping in areas where they might be obstructing or impeding progress in the right-of-way. And then 9414, as it stands now, in the downtown area, has a similar prohibition preventing people from obstructing those areas. There's also a state law which prohibits obstruction of a passageway.
So we already have the authority to require people not to block ADA accessible ramps. Is that?
I think if a person is camping there, Yes, because the 9411 prohibits camping in a way that obstructs those areas. And then 9414 prohibits obstructions in those areas in the downtown area. And then again, I mentioned there's a state law that prohibits obstruction of a passageway.
And that state law that prohibits obstructing a passageway would apply to all ADA accessible ramps across the city?
It would apply. I mean, there's always a question about when a person is obstructing it,
Sure.
but it does apply to passageways, sidewalks in general, yes.
Okay. So, Mayor, it does seem like we already are required to keep the ramps open and free. Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Poole.
So I'm a little bit confused because we had done away with amending 9414, and you were saying that there were some authorities in 9414 that would help with this, but they're not in 9411 because of the sitting in line piece. Is that correct?
9414, as it currently stands, which applies in the downtown area, prohibits obstructions. That's what the title of it is, obstruction in a downtown area, and it prohibits obstructions in the same way that the camping ordinance, camping code currently does. It prohibits a person from intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly rendering impassable or impeding the reasonable use of a public area, making usage of such area unreasonably inconvenient or hazardous.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Further discussion on this? Let's take a vote. Those in favor of this amendment, please raise your hand. Tovo, Kitchen, Pool, altered. Those opposed, please raise your hand. It's the balance of the dais. Does not pass. Any other amendments? Councilmember Kitchen.
Okay. Sorry, let me get this passed out. Okay, the amendment I'm just going to make directly onto the substitute motion that substitute ordinance that we're working from, because I didn't have it prepared, wasn't sure how this was going to come out. So on page B2 of the Ellis substitute, B2B that talks about the boundaries around the, well, let's see. Okay. Actually, now I need to ask a question about this. So this is talking about a quarter mile within any shelter outside the CBD. Is that the intent of this one? Okay. Well, then I may need an amendment, because my concern is what I passed out to you was the map around the South Austin Housing Center, and you can see that 1/4 mile is not sufficient given that terrain. So I think what I'd like to make my amendment to be within. So the language instead right now it reads within approximately 1/4 mile. I would say within 1/4 to 3/8 miles. So that makes it a little bit more, which will account for the terrain around the South Austin Housing Center.
Okay, there's an amendment offered by Councilmember Kitchen on page 2 to say that the campsite lying down in a public area, a person is located B within approximately 1/4 mile, to change it to 1/4 to 3/8 mile, adding 3/8 mile. Is there a second to that amendment? Councilmember Poole seconds that. Councilmember Kitchen.
And I have a question for Chris Coppola, I believe. So I had originally thought that the use of the term approximately that's in there now would allow for some discretion by the city manager, but I'm understanding from legal that what controls here is the term 1/4 mile, and so the use of the term approximately would not allow any authority by the city manager to vary that 1/4 mile, even given the circumstances in the terrain in a particular area. So that's why I am suggesting 1/4 to 3/8 mile. So is that my understanding correct?
Well,
Mr. Coppola?
I think what we've advised about the use of is more to do with the use of the word approximately. I think
Yes.
using the word approximately in the code is something we would discourage or recommend against, just because it doesn't give as much notice as possible to both law enforcement officers and to the public about exactly where they might be prohibited from camping. I think the requirement for posted signage helps to mitigate that potential due process issue, but in general, I think we would recommend against using the word approximately and setting a more precise boundary.
Okay, thank you. And that's why I'm proposing a more precise boundary, 1/4 to 3/8 of a mile.
Okay. Amendment has been seconded. Discussion? Councilmember Flanagan?
I don't know that putting the range is more precise, but I would be willing to strike the word approximately.
And I think overall what I would recommend is just if it's the will of the council, whatever boundary the council chooses should be the outermost one the council wants to choose. Rather than choosing a range, I think it would be clearer to say 3/8 a mile or 1/4 mile, either, whichever the.
I know.
So the reason that I disagree, and I think approximately fits in this location, is because the manager in designating the boundary is going to designate streets. And it may be that as he's trying to hit generally or approximately a 1/4 mile, if he's following streets as opposed to taking a limit through somebody's backyard, say, there might be some areas that's just over a 1/4 mile. There might be other areas that are just under a 1/4 mile. That's why it's approximately, and it gives the manager the discretion to be able to do that when he sets the boundaries. I think that's helpful. And then by way of notice, I think it calls for the posting of signs. So for that reason, in this particular instance, because it's coupled with the boundary setting by the manager, I think approximately is important.
I understand, and I think the signage does mitigate the due process concern, but overall, I'd say it's our recommendation that the word approximately not be used.
Okay. So the amendment in front of us right now is a 1/4 mile to 3/8. Councilmember Kitchen.
I want to hear the will of the dais. I'm happy to make it 3/8 if people are more comfortable with that. I'm happy to take out approximately. I just know that a 1/4 mile will not work around the South Austin Housing Center, and that's why I passed out the map, because there are schools that are outside the 1/4 mile on both the east and west, 2 elementary schools, Galindo Elementary and Athena Montessori. So if the interpretation is that approximately works, or if there's some interpretation, I want to be certain that that our city manager has the authority to take that into account. And so that's why I just thought the easiest thing to do would be to say 3/8.
The amendment in front of us right now is to add 3/8, so it goes 1/4 to 3/8 mile. Further discussion? Ready to take a vote? Those in favor of the amendment, please raise your hand. Tovo, Kitchen, Pool, Renteria, and Alter. Those opposed, please raise your hand. The balance of the dais, the amendment does not pass.
Okay, I have another amendment.
Okay.
I would like to understand what people's concerns are with not passing the previous one, and I would like to understand what language you would like to have instead, because I can also propose language specific to the South Austin Housing Center if that's what the objection is. But I think that I deserve to hear what the objection is. We promised people with regard to the South Austin Housing Center that we would take things into account when we're dealing with shelters in a neighborhood. So I am trying to make a very simple change, and so I'd ask for guidance from my colleagues. If you don't want to say 3/8 to 1/4, what would you like to say?
Council? Any further amendments to the section?
Mayor, I'd like to ask you what you would like to say. Are you comfortable with this at a 1/4 mile with what I have pointed out?
I am comfortable with it at a 1/4 mile. That's what I was proposing 6 to 8 months ago when we first started talking about it. I think that the manager will have the ability to come in with boundaries, and when he comes in with boundaries, if for whatever reason we don't like those boundaries, then certainly the council could step in at that point. We're also not at a place yet where we're setting up the South Austin Center, where we're coming up here is a general guideline that applies citywide, and I'm comfortable with this being a general citywide guideline. I know there were a lot of people that were thinking that a quarter mile was way too much, way too large a radius, and I know there were a lot of discussions about whether it should be smaller than that. There were some people that were suggesting it should be the same distance as the one that was downtown. I've suggested and argued against that. But I think that this is a good standard for me for the general rule in the city. And if there's something in particular that should happen on any particular one, once that gets closer, then certainly that's something that could be handled, and I think most appropriately at that time.
Okay, I have one last amendment then.
Okay.
I just passed out an amendment that is specific to the South Austin Housing Center. It says no camping, sitting, or lying down within 3/8 mile of the South Austin Housing Center homeless shelter at the time that the center becomes operational.
Okay. It's been a motion for an amendment from Councilmember Kitchen. Is there a second to this amendment? Councilmember Tovo seconds it. Any discussion? Councilmember Kitchen?
I'm proposing this because I think it's important to make certain that we are taking into account Athena Montessori Elementary School and Galindo Elementary.
Okay. Any further discussion? Let's take a vote. Those in favor of the amendment, please raise your hand. Alter, Tovo, Kitchen, and Pool. Those opposed? I'm sorry? And Peel? That's 5. Those opposed, please raise your hand. The balance of the die is at 6-5. Does not pass. Okay. Councilmember Tovo.
Well, we're talking about boundaries from emergency shelters. Our draft ordinance changes and earlier drafts that I thought were consensus positions had 3 blocks in every direction. And so it went to Brushy Street on the east side of 35. I noticed, Mayor, and then in response to the concern that would include underpasses, those were excluded. So in the version that we brought forward that's posted on today's agenda, it does have 3 blocks in every direction with the underpasses accepted. I will say we did have a fatal accident under one of those underpasses. I'm not sure if it was the ones, I've forgotten exactly what the cross street was, whether it was further north out of this boundary or whether it was underneath, but I feel confident that the police chief's guidance will identify those areas in the underpasses that are of highest risk. But I do note that your draft changes the eastern boundary, and so I would like to propose that we restore that boundary to 3 blocks from the arch in every direction, including east of 35, in response also to the concern that, or not the concern, but the point you made the other day, Councilmember Renteria, that there is at times a pretty substantial encampment outside of Terrazas Library. But I would certainly welcome your feedback on whether you, as the representative of that district, would support restoring that boundary to Brushy Street, or whether you feel I-35 is the place to stop.
Is there an amendment?
No, the amendment is to restore it to Brushy Street on the east.
Okay. And is it your point also to pick up the area under I-35? Is that your amendment? I'm just trying to get a...
No, it would look exactly like what we've proposed in our ordinance.
So you're proposing to change the eastern boundary to be Brushy, but not including the I-35 right-of-way?
Yes.
Okay. There's an amendment to change the area around the arch so as to make the east boundary Brushy, but not including the area in the I-35 right-of-way. Is there a second to that amendment? Councilmember Alter seconds that. Is there any discussion on that amendment? Okay, let's take a vote. Those in favor of that amendment, please raise your hand. Tovo Kitchen and Pool, and alter. Those opposed, please raise your hand. Balance of the dais. That also does not pass. Any further amendments to the substitute? Okay, then I think we're done with the amendments. Let's take a vote on which one of these we vote on first. If the first one passes, then we'll stop. If the first one does not pass, then we will vote on the second one. Those in favor of voting on the substitute first, please raise your hand. Those opposed? It's Tovo, Pool, Kitchen, and alter. Voting no, so we'll take up the vote on the substitute first. Those in, and also the.
May I just make sure that the record is clear that we would have to have scrivener's errors corrected from all the things that happened on the dais. Just make sure that when we write it up, there may be a few corrections that we do.
That's fine. And also the effective date would be 10 days and not 15 days. I think it was put as 15 days, but it should be 10 days. Any objection to that? Hearing none, that change is made. Okay. What? Yes?
What was the rationale for doing 15 days rather than 10 days? Because 15 days seems to put us into the area when the governor...
I think it was just inadvertent.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't
All right,
hear you over that.
It's okay. All right, let's take a vote on the substitute. Those in... Yes. Yes. Go ahead.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm loud too. All right. Frederick Douglass said, if there's no struggle, there's no progress. A lot of what we do up here is struggle. Disagreements are a fundamental part of the job and politics in general. I could point to a lot of big disagreements we've had in the city in recent years, but none of them, not one of them, have provoked such an intense reaction as the vote we took in June. We've all seen the unrelenting vitriol on social media, posts that have isolated incidents and dehumanizing language to paint a picture of a city under siege. There is no illusion on this dais that Austin does not have a serious crisis when it comes to homelessness. But we aren't going to fix anything by giving in. Difficulty, challenge, that's how we make progress. Austin's prosperity is the envy of cities across the country, but our great municipal shame is that while our median area income has soared, so has that of our population of residents experiencing homelessness. In light of that fact, reinstating bans on innocuous behaviors like sitting and lying or explicitly spelling out areas where these residents aren't welcome, for me, is extremely problematic. We've long acknowledged that Austin is a growing city, but we need to finally come to grips with the fact that Austin is a big city. And we're going to be true to our claim, we're going to be true to our claims of being a progressive city, we have to struggle with our big city problems and find some big city solutions to things like poverty and classism and racism. With amendments, I think we were able to improve what was proposed with these ordinance changes, but I personally cannot in good conscience vote to approve either. We've been told countless times now by national and local experts that criminalization of life-sustaining activities such as sleeping, camping, or just sitting in public spaces is counterproductive for solving homelessness. It does nothing but hide and shuffle around our homeless neighbors, making it difficult to connect them with services, which is supposed to be the point. I'm still proud of the work we did in June, and I'm committed to staying the course of addressing homelessness with proven solutions. I'll be abstaining.
Okay. Further discussion. Councilor Kassar.
Mayor, I appreciate the work done tonight. I think it's really clear that no one here stood with the idea of repealing the action from June, that everyone here recognizes how important it is for us to protect everyone's public health and safety, housed or unhoused, and setting clear rules and expectations. I hope that moving forward from here, we continue to focus on the root cause of the issue, which is providing housing and services. And I think that we're going to stand together in solidarity with the community against the governor taking actions against some of our most vulnerable neighbors. We are not going back, and I understand and believe that together we'll only go forward after tonight.
Okay, Councilmember Alter.
So I agree with Councilmember Cassar's last 2 points in particular. I want to highlight that everyone up on the dais is committed to trying to address our homelessness crisis and help the people in our community, our neighbors who are experiencing homelessness, get housed, and that we will stand firm together in the face of what may not be a pretty scene come November if the governor acts as promised. That being said, our community has asked us for clarity on these ordinances. Our police chief has asked us for clearer language. Asking to revise these ordinances to help restore a sense of public order does not automatically equate to a lack of compassion for our neighbors experiencing homelessness. I know that our city is compassionate, and we overwhelmingly share the same goal of helping those experiencing homelessness. It does not have to be mutually exclusive to provide compassionate care, services, and housing for all residents, including those experiencing homelessness, and to also be responsive to our residents expressing their desire to ensure public health and order. The majority of people in Austin do not see these two things as being mutually exclusive. From my perspective, the final product before us tonight does not provide the level of clarity that our community is asking for or that our law enforcement experts have requested in order to best do their jobs. I believe that we have provided some clarity as to whether or not people can camp on sidewalks or in high wildfire risk areas. But I also believe that it is missing very important elements for our community to help restore their trust in this body. We have seen extremely elevated levels of distrust and discontent from the public since the June changes. And while I was hoping that tonight we could reach a point where we could quell the bulk of the concerns we're hearing, I worry now that we will instead continue to face the repercussions of the June changes. For these reasons, I cannot support this version of the ordinance tonight.
Okay. Councilmember Ellis.
I just wanted to take a moment to say a few words about these ordinances. And I want it to be very clear, these ordinances are only one part of this issue. Our commitment, everyone up here on this dais, continues to be connecting those experiencing homelessness to housing, health care, and case managers so that they can help get themselves back into housing. Homelessness is a very complicated problem, but our ordinances should be as clear as possible. The rules should be simply stated, and the entire community should know what's allowed and what isn't allowed, whether you're experiencing homelessness, whether you're a first responder, or whether you're anyone else who wants our community to be the best that it can be. This ordinance, I think, that we're about to vote on, I know everyone did all of their work with the best of intention in their hearts, and while we may disagree on what is or is not already being enforced, I think it's important that we come together as a community and to realize that our biggest commitment is to housing, healthcare services, and case management. And that is really what all of this is about. These ordinances are just a piece of it. Thanks.
So I want to say that this ordinance is not perfect. And if I was drafting this ordinance myself, it would look different than this. But we're a deliberative body, and we have people representing multiple districts all over the city. And I think this provides greater clarity than currently exists. It'll provide better direction than currently exists. And it achieves some goals, in fact, many of the goals that were supported by most of us. I think we get lost sometimes in the things where we differ and don't recognize the overwhelming number of things that we agree upon. But I also think that the differences that we have, each of the differences that we discussed tonight, however they were resolved, are not going to be as important as as having a community that can pass an ordinance and do a pivot to focus everybody's attention and effort and resources on housing people and in ending homelessness in this city. I know this is hard, and I know this is not perfect, but I hope that we're able to recognize those things and still lead the community to the direction and to the task that is squarely in front of us.
Man.
Councilmember Tadillo.
You know, this is very difficult for me because I've worked with the homeless for decades. You know, but every around Easter, there we have a memorial for the homeless that have died out on the streets, and every year it's been going up higher and higher and higher, and it's because they are under the influence and walk out into the middle of the street and get hit and killed. They're hiding from the police officer in the creeks and the drains, and floods come and washes them down to and they drown. You know, they're out there getting murdered out there in the booty, dark campsites, out of sight. You know, unfortunately, you know, in every society, there's always that criminal element. They're not the majority, and they're not even close. But a very few of them can make it look like we're under siege. And that's not the case. You know, I know it because I talked to about 4 or 5 homeless people that I worked with one that he just passed away. He lived in the street for over 10 years. He was a veteran. He refused to leave the streets. He had a nickname. Everybody in the community loved him, Sapo. And he just passed away here just either yesterday. And but we finally got him off the street, so the last few years of his life, he got to live in a group home with other veterans. But he just did not want to leave the street. And he was a very good person. The kids loved him. You know, he liked to tease and play around. He got the nickname Sapo because there was a song out there, a Mexican song, that was said, Sop, Sop, Sapo. And he would used to bounce up and down like a frog. And so everybody gave him that nickname, you know. But I grew up with him. He lived there at Chalmers Court. You know, he was an unemployed veteran that came, you know, telling what the Vietnam War did a lot of things, really horrible things to my brothers and sisters that went down there. You know, I was fortunate enough to have a high draft number, so I didn't get drafted. But they came back, and they were very, very bad shape. And the VA hospitals did not help these veterans when they first came out. In fact, when they came back, they were basically called baby killers, you know, and they didn't have any parade. Everybody turned their back on them. My best friend that I grew up in school, he became he was drinking a case of beer a day, you know. And then after a while, I just lost track. I don't know whatever happened to him. He could be out there in the streets right now. I wouldn't know, you know. So these are the people that are out there in the street, and we cannot turn our back on them, you know. And I know it's very hard because you see these people that take advantage of them. They pick them up there and pick up some of the old ladies there at the arch and take them out to the corner and give them a sign to beg for money. And then he pays them, he collects the money and gives them drugs and alcohol. And they do that every day. But we need to do something, and I think this is about the best that we're going to be able to do. Is it perfect? No. But I know that it's the right thing to do.
So So I have a few things I want to say. I think that I've said all along, and I remain committed to what I think is a shared goal for all of us, and that's to focus on connecting people to housing. It's so important that we need to get to a place, and we need to continue our commitment to making it unnecessary for anyone in this community to camp in public spaces. That is really the bottom line, and that is the only thing that's really going to be a solution. At the same time, from my perspective, I don't believe that allowing folks to camp, and not even allowing, I don't believe that protecting people or failing to protect people from camping in places that are unsafe, I don't think that's compassionate. And I don't want to be part of an ordinance that doesn't protect people, but doesn't make a statement on where it's not safe for people to camp. I think it is our responsibility as council members, and I'm speaking for myself, I think it's my responsibility as a council member to make a statement and a judgment and a decision on public health and safety. That is my responsibility, I believe, as a council member. And I believe that means that it's important for me to state in an ordinance where it is not safe for people to camp. I had hoped to be able to vote for this tonight. The council needs to move forward, the community needs to move forward and put this divisiveness behind us. But I cannot support this. There are a number of areas that I've already spoken to that I won't repeat, that are critical areas for the part of the city that I represent. And I think that we have not acknowledged those areas. I don't believe that it is appropriate and wouldn't be responsible for me to think that we had addressed those areas when we failed to put them clearly in front of us so that everyone could see and understand in the ordinance. So I'm sorry that I will not be able to support this, but it doesn't achieve the goals that I think are necessary. It doesn't achieve clarity. It doesn't make a statement that I think is my responsibility as a council member on the places that are unsafe, and so I cannot vote for it.
Councilmember Poole.
Thanks to everybody for all your efforts from the very beginning till tonight. I want to thank Council Members Kitchen and Tovo, especially for doing such a heavy lift on this effort to provide law enforcement officials clear language on matters relating to health and safety. As Councilmember Alter said, the community has been asking for more clarity on what has been a painful and at times confusing conversation for everybody. As Councilmember Kitchen said, we need to connect people to housing. But that also means having the means to house them and get them there, the resources and the systems of support for their health and safety, for the health and safety of everyone in our city. Because most Austinites do agree that decriminalization is the compassionate and right thing to do. But it's not enough. We still have to care for people and ensure their health and safety. I do think we were able to move the ball forward on providing greater clarity, but only on one safety issue tonight, and that is camping on land that the city has designated to be a high risk of wildfire. I still believe we need more clarification on the health and safety issues for people sleeping outdoors. I won't rest until we have more clarity and we are able to house people who are sleeping out of doors. Sidewalks are not campsites. They're not housing sites. They are passageways. They are not safe and they're not built for sleeping. And I hope the day doesn't come that I wake up and find out that someone camping on a median who hasn't been moved away or found a better place dies because we've allowed that person to pitch a tent and live there. It just doesn't seem humane to me. It just doesn't seem right. I will also be voting against this because it doesn't do enough. Thank you.
Councilmember Tovo? I'm sorry? Do you want to speak, Councilmember Garza?
Sure. I just wanted to thank the mayor for the proposed substitute language. And I will say again, I stand by what we did in June. I truly believe we changed what, frankly, in my mind was like modern day redlining in the city. We decided where certain people could live, or certain people could sit, or certain people could camp. And I'm proud of the work that we did to change that. And I could not support going any, what felt like actually broadening that and making the prohibition that used to just apply to downtown now apply to areas throughout our city. And so this is incredibly difficult because I want to vote no on everything. But as Councilmember Harper-Madison pointed out, this has been the most divisive issue that I've ever seen on this council. And my hope is that by voting yes to this substitute language, which includes, and I'm grateful for, the work my office did with the advocates and the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. My revisions to the substitute language were with their help, and we got every single one of those amendments into this one except for one. And so I'm grateful for being able to I think, make the June ordinance more progressive. And so my yes vote is in hopes of our community being able to move forward. I respect all the work that everybody has done. It's been extremely hard. I have to say, I don't think it's fair to frame this as, not caring about the possibility of people dying somewhere, because regardless if we passed every single amendment, there could have still been somebody camping somewhere that was prohibited and they could have gotten hurt. So whether we approve something or not does not stop bad things from happening.
Yeah, thank you. As I understand the vote before us, we're voting on whether to substitute the current motion for the main motion. Is that correct?
No, we've taken, we built out the two substitutes, and then we took a vote on which one we were going to vote on first. And the vote was to vote on the substitute first, and that's what we're voting on. So before us is the substitute. What I said was if what we voted on first didn't pass, then we would call for a vote on the second one.
So I'm not going to support the substitute motion for the reasons that several of my colleagues have articulated. This has been a tremendously challenging process, and I'm glad that regardless of which motion passes, we're making some clarifications. I think that is what our community needs, both those who are experiencing homelessness, our law enforcement, the general public. But I still think the main motion has a better range of clarifications, and that's really what is needed in our community. And, as several of us have echoed at various points, I'm very eager to move beyond this conversation and kind of back to what we had been focusing on, which is working to end homelessness. That is what we all need to work together on, and we need the private sector's help. This is not going to be something that the city can do on its own, nor can our really fabulous housing and social service providers implement all of the solutions we need. So this has to be, so regardless of where you landed on the question of the ordinances, I hope you'll be engaged. If you're not already, I hope you'll be engaged in that larger process, which is what we really need to focus on, of of making sure that all of our neighbors have a safe place to sleep and that none need to be camping outside in our public spaces.
We ready to take a vote? Those in favor of the Ellis substitute, please raise your hand. Harper Madison, Flanagan, Cassar, Mayor Pro Tem Garza, Ellis, Renteria, me, 7. Those opposed? The other 4. Voting no? 7-4. It passes. Thank you. Substitute passes. All right, let's continue on with our calendar. I think let's take up item number 30, resolution. Councilmember Tovo, do you have a motion?
Mayor?
Yes.
Do you want to proceed, Councilmember Tovo? Or?
We certainly could, but if there's a will on council to postpone both of the resolutions, that sure would be terrific.
Mayor, I'd like to...
As many of you know, I've not been feeling well, and I've sort of made it as long as I probably can, but if we're proceeding forward tonight with the 2 resolutions, I'll certainly stay for that.
Mayor, I'd like to propose that we postpone both these resolutions so we can take them up together. I think asking Councilmember Tovo, we have respected other colleagues when they had issues, family issues, or whatever issues. I think Councilmember Tovo, she may not want to say this, and I'll just say that this has been a very tough day for her, and she is not feeling well. I think that we could all address this better if we would allow her to go home at this point and postpone the resolutions. I think all of us could focus on the resolutions better at another time. So I could make a motion, or
Well, let's see what people want to think on the dais. The only concern I have is that every time we have this conversation, it's a pretty traumatic conversation in the community. And I really want the community to be able to make a pivot from this to actually focusing on housing people in our city. So, I mean, my let's see what the will of the body is, but being able to resolve these issues tonight so that they don't have to come back to the council. I hate to put everybody in the community that came and testified today and bring everybody back again to come and testify yet again for like the 4th time, I think.
Well, so Mayor, I mean, I certainly don't want to be the reason that people need to come back again. I will remain, though. Again, I would just underscore that we have postponed items that were more time sensitive for lesser reasons, that one of us had to kind of continually leave the dais because they were physically ill from a migraine. But I will stick it out, since I'm sure that's probably going to be everybody's or many of my colleagues' preference. I do think there's a value of taking these up on a separate day, because they are continuing to be seen through the light of the ordinance, and at least the one that we brought forward is, and it's very much about that broader connecting of people and really making a commitment as a council to connect individuals to housing and services. But nonetheless, I will.
My sentiment was not by any measure an insistence, so I think it's good to hear from other people on the dais. Mayor Pro Tem Garza.
Are there a lot of amendments for any of these? I just assumed we were going to vote for, we could be done with this in like 3 minutes, unless there are amendments. We had a lengthy discussion at work session about both of these, and so
Does anybody have any amendments to either one of these, either 30 or 32? Appears not. Yes, Councilmember Tovo.
I would like an opportunity to outline the changes that my quorum made, because they were directly responsive to the comments and concerns that I heard on Tuesday. You've just now distributed another version of yours, and
It's the same one that was posted, wasn't changed.
okay, it said version 2. Is that just version 2, and the first one was
That
the one
was
from the
posted.
special
Version
call?
2 was posted.
Can you?
It was posted before the Tuesday work session. No?
Mayor?
Hang on a second.
I don't think, I mean, usually if it's posted, then it doesn't need to be on yellow. So maybe could you give us a sense of what has changed from the version that was in our backup when the council agenda posted?
Okay, let me get that. If you want to talk about 31, I'll get that information.
Mayor, I would like to make a motion to postpone. I would just like to get us. I don't think that what's in these ordinances are particularly time sensitive, and I out of respect for my colleague, and I know that she won't ask for this, but out of respect for my colleague, I'd like to make a motion to postpone
Okay.
to both resolutions.
All right, I'm going to, I think we should postpone the resolutions. Let's go ahead and postpone the resolutions.
Thank you.
Everybody
Thank
okay
you.
with that? All right, so let's move, we'll postpone both 30 and 32.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry to leave you all, but I'm
That's
going to
okay.
do that.
All right, let's go to the next item that we have, sir. What?